Hey folks, let's learn a little bit more about the oil and gas industry. All right, we have back our special guest. We try to do this every month, but I've been busy and we've skipped a little bit of time. So we have Rhod Mackenzie of Russia Info on. How you doing, Rhod?
I'm good, Mark. I'm good. How are you?
Busy, hot here. It's Houston has hit over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the last week in a row, and we haven't even hit August yet.
Wow. We're only 33 degrees Celsius. I think that's only about 87, 88.
Yeah. So much cooler temperature. And we're doing this via Skype because, Rhod, where are you?
Yeah, basically I'm in Ufa in southern Russia, just bottom end of the Ural Mountains.
Yeah, but you don't sound like you have a Russian accent.
That's because I'm not from Ufa, I'm not Russian, I'm actually from Scotland.
Yeah, and you've lived and traveled all over the world, and now you're running a successful business there in Russia.
Yeah, basically focused on commodities, mainly oil and gas, but also covering gold and the other major commodities that Russia has such an abundance of.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. We were talking off the mic a second ago, but we're talking about Brexit, and a lot of people in the U.S. especially don't really understand the history, what the European Union is, and how the Brexit's going to affect, especially the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, I mean, basically, President Obama came and the president of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, etc., saying that Britain should remain in part of the European Union, and their pleas, along with others, were ignored. And I think that was mainly because what started out in 1953 as the Iron and Coal and Steel Confederation of countries morphed into what was the European Economic Commission, which was a trading bloc, which then became the European Union. Now, everybody in even the UK is not aware there's actually 4 presidents. Do you know there's 4 presidents?
No, I didn't know there were 4 presidents, no.
Okay. Firstly, there's the Jean-Claude Juncker is president of the EU Commission, which is the overall governing body. Then you have the European Parliament, which is elected by various members are elected by their different countries. It has 670, I think, at the last count, and they come from the various countries. Then you have the chairman of the European Council, who basically heads up the council of the prime ministers of the member states, all 28 of them. And then you have the president of the Council of Europe, and that is actually a rotating presidency where each country takes 6 months of being president of.
Wow, now, what a mess.
Yeah, well, no, it's very interesting, Mark, because we talk about democracy in America and in various countries, but the EU is actually one of the most undemocratic institutions. Jean-Claude Juncker is actually appointed and voted on as president by the Council of Ministers, which is the prime ministers of the 28 countries. And you can imagine the horse trading that goes on there.
Right.
Donald Tusk is also was elected by the Council of Ministers. Now, the main executive is called the EU Commissioners. Now, each country puts forward a commissioner, and they go from every portfolio from economic to environmental to energy, etc. Now, these are voted for by, guess what, the prime ministers, and then they're rubber stamped by the European Parliament. So, far from being a democracy, it's actually a stitch-up.
Yeah, and I didn't know any of this.
Right. So that's one of the reasons I think that the UK decided that having laws on how much of a curvature can be on a cucumber and the wattage that you can have on your hairdryer and all of these directives, they were put down by the 28 commissioners in committee rooms with the members of the European Parliament. Now, it's interesting because we're talking now energy, which is what we're particularly interested in. And gas was one of the few things that sanctions were not applied on to Russia.
Yeah, let me stop you there. For my U.S. audience, he's talking about natural gas, not gasoline, natural gas.
Yeah, I'm talking not about petroleum, as you would call it, or gasoline, but natural gas. Russia is the largest individual supplier of gas to the European Union. It supplies something, it varies between 32 and 37%. Right. Now, they attempted to introduce what they call the third energy package, which meant they wanted the European Commission to basically negotiate on behalf of all the countries of the European Union on the delivery of gas. Now, there are 3 pipelines currently. One is the Friendship pipeline that goes through the Ukraine. The other one is the Yamal Europe, and the third one is Nord Stream, and they're about to build Nord Stream 2. Are you familiar with those, Mark?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, Nord Stream are actually a major client of mine. The company is 50% owned by Gazprom. It's based in Switzerland. Its head is a German. Its finance director is a Brit, and it's based in Zug in Switzerland.
Yeah.
It also ships gas from the Russian coast straight through the Baltic and into Germany. Also owns a pipeline called the Opal pipeline that cuts straight through Germany and links up with the other pipelines in Europe that can distribute gas to almost any part of it. However, Markus Sefcovic, who is a career diplomat, yeah, I said diplomat, he's now head of the EU energy policy. Now, you're aware that there's been a situation in the Ukraine over the past couple of years.
There's been a bunch of situations. Which situation?
Just the fact that Russia and the European Union, America, etc., are not very happy with each other over the situation in the Ukraine.
It's progressively gotten worse over the last couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas between 2007 and 2014, it had its moments, because what used to be called the Friendship pipeline when it was the first pipeline built between the Soviet Union and Europe for the supply of gas. Now, the Ukraine for quite a number of years, in fact since its independence from the Soviet Union and where Russia became independent, its economic progress has been lethargic, to say the least, sloth-like, some people would say.
It's actually went backwards, I think.
Backwards by about 20 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so whenever there was a problem economically, they would steal gas from the underground storages and the pipelines.
Right.
So Gazprom decided firstly to build the Nord Stream pipeline, which is what they've done, and also the infrastructure of the Ukraine pipeline system hasn't been maintained and will not continue to be maintained.
It's old and it's falling apart, yeah.
Yeah. So Gazprom obviously are looking to solve 2 problems. One, the aging infrastructure and the fact there'll be no investment in it, with how can we provide a safe and secure system of delivery with a minimum of disruption. So Nord Stream 2, straight through the Baltic Sea, no countries to argue with apart from within their sea waters.
Right.
And that's what's currently happening. Now, the EU are control freaks, right? They do not want Russia to control 30% of the gas on their own terms. Right. Now, you keep claiming that Russia is an unreliable energy partner, but there has been no interruption of the gas supply since the 1970s. The price negotiations have changed dramatically since LNG started to come to the market, etc.
Right.
It's political, and that's the main reason for the British leaving and the conflict between Russia and the EU. It's all about a political construct.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense now that you've kind of laid out how that works. So how is the Brexit going to affect that situation?
Well, first, in the past couple of weeks, there's been all sorts of threats. But when the world's 5th biggest economy and the 2nd biggest economy in the EU decides to go, obviously those people who've got this privileged elite position are going to try and defend their position as much as they possibly can.
Right. Right. They want to keep their political base, keep the money coming in, the power, all that stuff.
And the expansion. I mean, they're now looking to add further countries into the EU. I mean, what most people in America don't realise is 40% of the budget of the EU goes on the common agricultural policy.
Yeah, I knew that. Right? That's a huge number, yeah.
Yeah, and that's basically to buy up food. So it's nothing to do with free trade. In fact, it discriminates against farmers in the US, in Canada, in Africa, in Asia, importing rice from Asia or grain from Russia or whatever. It's a totally discriminating policy. And on energy, trying to control it, as we said, it's a bit like nailing down Jello. It's a nice concept, but it's not really going to work, particularly with energy sources. We discussed LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, multiple sources, multiple ways of doing it. I mean, the whole of the American economy was transformed by cheap energy, fracking for gas and for oil.
The whole world is transformed, right? Whenever you bring cheap, reliable energy to a part of the world, you start having progress, you start having prosperity. Yeah, 100%.
Unfortunately, Mark, in the EU, you don't, because they've bet the farm on renewables.
Yeah, and we have a little bit about that here. It's actually, we were talking about this earlier. One of our states, New England, has a terminal where they bring in LNG from the Caribbean to New England to supply their gas because they think it's environmentally unresponsible to tap into the frack gas. And so they're paying $8 per billion cubic foot from the Caribbean natural gas. They could get the frack gas for $2 per billion cubic. But once again, they think they're doing the right thing. They just don't understand how it really works.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing. I mean, from a petrochemicals perspective, many European petrochemicals concerns that are actually global companies but had their head office in Europe moved a large number of their facilities because the production of petrochemicals is very energy intensive.
Right.
So they moved the production over to the US.
Right. Less expensive to operate. Got it.
Russia has quite a large number of projects being planned and will continue to be planned simply because its gas, natural gas in Russia is much, much cheaper, energy costs are much, much lower, and Russia's looking forward to producing a much more balanced budget and not being a net, just simple fossil fuel exporter.
Yeah, it's interesting. So people here, and there's some smart people all over the world, but there's a lot of work going on right now to capture a lot of that petrochemical business in the developing countries, India, China, Africa. And one of the things like an ethylene cracker that converts natural gas to plastic, where we're in a race with Russia right now because the U.S. and Russia both have cheap natural gas. U.S. and Russia both have the technology to build these ethylene crackers, and the U.S. and Russia both have cheap transportation to the rest of the world because we have deep water ports on every coast. So we're in a race with Russia to see who can get these ethylene crackers built first and grab that market share. And I think that's great. I think it's great for us and Russia.
I think it's great for both countries, and also for the exchange of technologies and doing business. I mean, many Russian, American companies have been active in Russia for many years, and will continue to do so. I mean, Rex Tillerson is a very frequent visitor to Moscow.
Yeah, let me pause right here. This is a good place to talk about what you do. So if you're listening to this and you're interested about doing business in Russia, what Rhod does, he gathers all this project data from all these projects that are going on in oil and gas and mining and other things, and he can give you access to that so you can see where the projects are, what's going on, who are the key players. Did I do a decent job explaining what you do?
Yeah, I'm actually about to launch a new product, and it's going to take about another 6 weeks to finalize. It's called Petropolyplast, which is going to be looking at the petrochemicals, polymers and plastics sector in Russia.
Yeah, so if you're interested in doing business in Russia in any of those sectors, reach out to Rhod. We'll put a link to his website in the show notes. But he's just a wealth of information of what's going on in Russia. And I'm not quite sure how we even met originally, but I love these dialogues because I learned one of the things, if you're here in the U.S., you have to be careful of. What you see in the media is not always what the reality is. And this is a perfect example where we're hearing from somebody in Russia about what's going on, and it's a different story than what our media is telling us.
I think that, Mark, is why you have so many fans, because the alternative media has more respect than the mainstream media, because 80% of the world's media is owned by 6 major corporations.
Yeah, and they're no longer worried about doing good, honest journalism. They're worried about making money, right? And so the more people they can get to watch, the more they can charge for their commercials, and whether they're talking the truth or not, they don't care anymore, which is sad.
Absolutely. Where, people like ourselves, we want to educate, we want to inform, and we want to help people do business.
Yeah. So going back to the Brexit, how do you think that's going to affect the business in Russia?
I think that prior to Brexit, because the British actually were behind the sanctions and really strongly because of the relationship between the US and the UK, whereas France and various other countries, Italy for example, were really suffering. I mean, even the Irish were exporting something like £300 million, which is about $440 million worth of pigs, right? Pig meat.
Right.
Agricultural produce has gone. Right. These were markets. I mean, something like 60 billion over the last 2 years of agriculture and food produce has been lost by the EU. Now, that can only change with sanctions being dropped. However, I go to my local supermarket and my bananas come from Ecuador. You know, my apples now come from South Africa rather than Poland.
Right.
These markets have gone and they're not going to come back again.
Yeah, that's a good point. So when you think about that, when the sanctions happened and we cut off different supplies, the Russian people still needed those products, right? And so they found other markets. So when the sanctions are dropped, did that decision destroy those native markets? Like, will it ever go back, do you think?
I think very much so. I mean, even on holiday resorts, I mean, when the Turks shot down the Russian airliner, immediately 5 million Russians stopped holidaying in Turkey.
Right.
Now, you just take 5 million people stop going for vacation in one particular country. That's going to cause a huge drop in its tourist industry. I mean, the Russians were actually the largest single individual tourist. I mean, twice as many as the Germans or the British or whoever.
Yeah, so there's an economic impact that people probably didn't foresee. Yeah.
So in oil and gas, it's different because that's always been a global business, and most of the companies involved in oil and gas tend to have offices in various parts of the world. I know people within the Australian government, for example, in representatives in Russia. Gas, as I mentioned earlier, was never considered part of the sanctions. So if a product had a dual purpose, as in oil or gas, the commercial attaché said, it's gas. So I think that a lot of companies, American, Australian and whatever, it's business as usual. I mean, the politicians do things their way. Business will always succeed.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate here, and I'm sure this applies to a lot of other parts of the world, but here, our politicians don't understand the business of oil and gas, and yet they want to regulate it and make rules around it. And it's to the point now where it's starting to get ridiculous. It's increasing the cost of operations here, where the raw feedstock is dirt cheap. And it makes me wonder and I know this industry. Chevron starts having increased costs in California. They quit drilling in California, come to Texas. If they have increased costs in the U.S. as a whole, they'll go to North Africa or Australia, wherever it is. So, it's a good lesson learned that our politicians need to understand the business before they try to enact any type of legislation.
The biggest problem is most politicians think government is the solution. I seem to remember, because I'm old enough, that Ronald Reagan said, government is the problem.
Yeah. I was Ronald Reagan, I think, was one of the best U.S. presidents ever, at least in my lifetime, because he understood the boundary. He understood that more government is a problem, and that accountability is at the people level, not the government level. I mean, he was great.
And that business has to be called to account, but business also must be allowed to create jobs, create prosperity, and that's what businesses do.
Yeah, that's what good business do, that's for sure. So, Rhod, it's about time for us to close the show out, and we usually talk about alcohol. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, it's hot, it's a sweaty day, etc. And when I've done my various bits, I just love to relax with a glass full of ice and 4 fingers of Bombay Sapphire.
Bombay Gin, boy, that brings back memories.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely aromatic, topped up with tonic, and it's that little bit of England in Ufa.
Yeah, yeah. So it's the English do love their gin. I actually have spent not a lot, I've spent a good bit of time in the UK, especially London, and they get a little upset with me because I don't know the differences in the different gins, and it's like it's not a big deal here.
Yeah, well, you actually produce some reasonable ones. I've actually purchased, and I've consumed them. But for the next one, I'll show you a couple of US gins I can actually get here in Russia.
What's gonna be interesting when we do that. Let's see if you get it cheaper. That's just not fair. It's not fair. All right, Rod. I appreciate your time. Like I said, folks, you need to check him out if you're looking to do business in Russia. And then we will see you again in another month.
Excellent work. Thank you.
Yeah, folks. I hope this helped. We will see you next time.